Strategies for Change, the Role of Social Movements with Laurence Cox from NUI Maynooth.
I've been involved in movements since the 1980s, so it's a third of a century by now. I've seen a lot of movements, and I try and help movements in different ways, sharing what I've learned, because there's a lot more similarities in what you need to do to fight for your rights between different movements, actually quite separate from what the issue is, which is sometimes a hard thing to hear. But the realities of trying to change the world are often quite similar for different groups that are oppressed in different ways, exploited, discriminated against, looked down on. I should say as well, I've got a disabled partner myself. So I'm not disabled, but I've learned quite a bit from talking to her, and we keep on arguing about a disability movement in Ireland and where it should go, and what's happening, and so on and so forth. And I'm sure, like a lot of people, she gets very despondent sometimes, and she goes, I do not have the energy. So the first thing is just, well, what is a social movement? Because with all due respect to the independent living movement, it gets confusing because a lot of organizations call themselves movements, which is fine. It doesn't mean they're wrong, but there's a bigger way of thinking about the disability movement, or whatever you might like to call it, the movement of disabled people, or something else. We'll see people argue about what to call their movements. But they're networks of lots of different formal organizations who know each other, sometimes work together, sometimes talk together, sometimes argue. And then informal groups could be very small, mightn't even have a website or a proper name, but just groups of people who work together. And then individuals who might be quite well known or might have particular legal skills, might be experts that get called on or whatever. But all of those things coming together starts to make up a movement. But put together with that there's a conflict. There's something which ultimately means somebody that you have to push against. And sometimes it's the state, people talking about needing to change the law, change policies. Sometimes it's corporations, people talking about changing business attitudes. It might be medical professions, religious institutions, or dominant social groups, which could be very, very broad. It could be abled people. But there's a conflict, there's a tension, maybe around money and economics, around power and politics, around culture and how we think of ourselves and how we talk, or all of those. So there's a push in society, there's a move in society. And the movement exists partly because there's some sense, okay, well, there is a movement of disabled people or a disability movement or a something. There is a thing that it's worth arguing about, what should we call it? Or we'd like there to be. And we've got enough of a way of talking to each other, some way of communicating, and some way of discussing, well, what should we do? What do we mean? So that's quite vague. Yeah? But over time, it can be extraordinarily powerful. And those of you who are a bit older will remember growing up in an Ireland where divorce was illegal, where contraception was illegal, where homosexuality was illegal, where abortion was illegal. And you've seen a movement over decades push against that and win in many, many ways. So it's vague, but it's real, even if it's hard to think about. So why does that happen? Because in Ireland, quite often we don't like conflict. We don't like the thought, I've got to actually have a row with people. I've got to try and push people, particularly if we're dependent on them, if they're our parents, partners, carers, people who have power over us. But here's why. It's not just that our lives are bad, that there's oppression or exploitation or stigmatization. It's also that when we try and do something about it, the systems and structures that exist don't work. The laws or the policies or the people or the proper channels, they don't do what they're supposed to do, or they don't do what we need them to. And big part of the reason for that is that there's somebody else there who doesn't want them to do that. So kind of by definition, people who have power do not have an interest in giving power away. They don't actively want other people to be powerless. They just don't want other people to be powerful. People who are wealthy don't particularly want, they don't necessarily want other people to be poor, but they don't want to share that wealth on the whole. They don't want to change a system that benefits them. People who are looked up to, people who are respected, people who seem powerful and healthy and happy and cheerful and shiny. They don't want other people to be miserable necessarily, but they certainly want to be on the top of that heap of respect. So there's actually a conflict there. And that's why just raising awareness about an issue very often doesn't change it. Just going through the proper channels doesn't change it. You've got to do something more. You've got to go through the kinds of efforts that you're going through. So that's difficult. And what it means is very often stepping outside the world the way they've created it. So if somebody else has got the power and uses it to block you getting your rights, to block you getting something you need or whatever, you look around and go, well, do we have numbers? Can we put 30 wheelchairs on the street outside one government office? Or can we disrupt what they do? If they've got the money, can we get in the way of that? Can we block the road? Or if mainstream culture seems to exclude us, well, can we be creative? Can we find ways of showing that we're here, showing that we exist? So that's, like I say, it's not easy. It's not a situation anybody chooses to be in, but it's a situation very many people find themselves in. And one guy, Marshall Gantz, who's done a lot of work on this, says, look, social movements are all about turning what you have, whatever you have, into the thing that you need to get what you want. So you know what you want starting out, but then you have to find out, what do we need to change in order to get that? And then what do we have that we can use to create whatever it is we need to get that? And that's the movement. If there's a problem, if there are forces in society, it's usually an alliance, called it here a disabling alliance, of forces that are actively disabling other people. How do you disrupt that alliance? How do you name the different groups involved and break up their alliances? And on our side, how do you make alliances to bring about a different kind of society. So saying, are there people we can get on our side? Are there people like parents or carers or disabled people who could disengage from supporting that if they understood the social model? These kinds of questions, because half of building a movement is disrupting what's on the other side, is breaking up that alliance, stopping that vicious circle of everybody supporting it. And it can be a bit uncomfortable sometimes to name names, especially when those names are close to us, when we're dependent on them. But seeing that, okay, here is somewhere where we could make change. Here is somewhere that if we can unpick this alliance, if we can stop people just passively supporting this or actively thinking their interest is in going along with this, then we're freeing up a lot of energy, because people put a lot of energy into keeping things the way they are. There's a big budget in keeping things the way they are. People talked about an industry and professions and so on. So free up a bit of that energy, and there might actually be more potential there than it can seem. So that's the one side, that's their side, if you like. How can activists disrupt the disabling alliance and develop an alliance with other forces for a different kind of society? In some other countries where there's better provision, it also has to do with there being a broader alliance for social equality, that it's not necessarily always the disability movement on its own, but disabled struggles as part of or in alliance with other struggles. So on our side then, the mirror image of that question about disrupting is the question about building a movement. And there's a few questions there, a few ways of putting it. One is, who is there who might join us, who might become mobilized, come into movement, but right now is inactive? So who might be able to join us? And obviously, any movement spends a lot of time thinking, how can we get people doing this? People who are well able to do what we do. But then there's also the question of who is there out there who is active, but in totally destructive ways? So top-down ways, charity ways, clientelistic and deferential ways, or just around very specific issues only, where they don't see the issue as around disability, around the social model. They see it around their one thing, or about services just in one part of the country, or just about them very personally. So people who are already putting energy into this, but not as part of the movement. So that's a question. And another way of saying it is, well, there's a potential, but how do you make that potential real? How do you get to what the movement is capable of being? Often, one way people ask themselves that question is they look at other countries, or even they look at movements around other issues and go, okay, that's where we want to be. Now, where are we? How do we get there? So I've put this in, I couldn't find a way of making this, of breaking this up. So I'm sorry, I'll try and break it up as I talk through it. So what do we need? Is it a goal, a strategy, tactics, language, something else to build a movement and a bigger coalition to bring other people who aren't disabled on the side of the disability movement, allies? How to build the movement, how to build the coalition of allies, and how to make it, of course, it's got to be broader. You need more people, you need more groups. We need a lot of those people that have been mentioned who are currently part of the problem to stop being part of the problem, to go, okay, actually, we now want to be led by disabled people. We want to break away from the medical model. We want to orient to the social model or whatever. So along with that, deeper. Fiona, you want to come in there?
I think that's one of the crux in that we have to break through, so traditional disability services really have all the power,
Yeah.
And like they're not going to go anywhere quickly, So it's about having a strategy to work with them and to bring them over to our side, So we need to sort of convince them, or it is convincing that people have voices and they have lived experiences, but like we all just want to live ordinary lives as well, and like they have to buy into, well, they're just not doing a great job at the moment.
Yeah, no, and that's why I think it's always important not just to say, can we get more groups involved? Because you can imagine a lot of organizations paying lip service to a new language. It's a thing that people in organizations are very good at, is going, oh yeah, I'll come along to that conference, I'll make all the right noises and so on. And as somebody said, look, there's even, there's plenty of law and policy that is right on paper, but isn't actually what they do. So it's got to be not just broader, but then it's got to deepen. There's got to be some way of getting more commitment, more participation, deeper understanding, a longer term strategy. So these are big questions. Yeah, how to do that. Both how to break up the alliances that keep things the way they are, and how to build something broad and deep with allies on this side to really change it. Part of what that means is finding a way, when people say they're allies, finding a way of something you can ask them that actually changes their behavior. So if you think of the Black civil rights movement in the United States, of course, loads of people were saying, oh, we don't believe in segregation, we don't believe in differences between black and white. But then what the movement said to them is, okay, come down here to Alabama, to Mississippi or whatever, and break the law with us. And you can see what that does to people, because if they do that, then suddenly they can no longer sit on both sides of the fence. It's not straightforward. I'm not trying to give answers. I think you probably have a lot of the answers you need when you sit down and strategize with each other about it. But how to get people beyond just making the right noises to actually being on the right side.
Individually, collectively agreeing to goals across all impairment groups, convincing other disabled people to be on our side, including those that benefit from the status quo, changing mindsets of those people that are grounded in the medical model of disability. Parents that are overprotective and don't empower their son or daughter to think for themselves. Those with intellectual impairments can be minded too much. Confidence. Some disabled people find it difficult to challenge existing disabling systems. Having the energy to progress. It can be hard work and time consuming. Organizationally, reluctance of individual disability services moving over to our side might be the first ones to move with us. Disability services and care agencies fear of losing status, losing funding, giving up power to disabled people. Reluctance of disability organizations and services changing the rules and policies that control disabled people. Laws that still exist, for example, the Lunacy Act. Our Constitution does not serve disabled people. Reluctance of breaking away from segregation. The public sphere. Disabled people not being portrayed positively in the media, preaching to those that need it, but also preaching to those that are not associated or affiliated to the world of disability. Research not making a difference. We need to realize that a ground-up approach is the only way, using our lived experiences collectively to bring about change.
Look, what makes an impact, what changes power relations, is the people who are affected by those power relations deciding to take action and coming together to do so, and then finding allies. And you can see, like, I give this kind of talk workshop with lots of different groups. I'm never sure what level to pitch it at. But you guys, after a year of this course, you absolutely know this where this is at. This wasn't a surprise to you. You've got all the material there. You probably, even before hearing about the social model or doing the course or becoming activists, you had that knowledge, but you didn't know you had it. And now you have that knowledge because you've thought about it from the point of view of wanting to bring about change, not just from the point of view of somebody affected, but you're affected and you want to bring about change, and you've worked together. And you see how much understanding, not just of why things are the way they are, but of how we can change them, you've already got. And that's really, really crucial then, is not to go back and look for academics or anybody else to solve it for you, because they don't necessarily know. They haven't brought change about. You do need to be talking to people in other organizations, people in other countries, people in other movements about what they do that works, about what they see makes a difference, so that you're thinking forwards not just from books or from what somebody's sold you, but from talking to other people who, like you, are pushing against huge odds.